All right, welcome back to the Contrarians. This is another episode of our kind of new concept. It seems like a concept that should have smacked us in the face. That makes a lot of sense, but it's essentially we're looking at now these days the most contrarian album by a band. Not necessarily our favorite. How we used to do this, where it was like, hey, we picked a contrarian choice as our favorite album. This is more like what is a weird album in the band's catalog. And today we have with us Sean Kelly, a Canadian music treasure, writer of this book, actually 10 years ago now, right?
Wow, hard to believe.
I think, yeah. And this looks at all the sort of local Canadian heroes, the people that Sean cut his teeth on. And obviously, the big news is he's got a new book out. Don't call it hair metal. This is out through ECW Press, and it's a great treatise on treating heavy metal or hair metal as essentially an art form, breaking it down. You talk to all your heroes in this book as well. I don't know. Anything else you want to say about this?
Well, you know what? It's actually interesting because that one of the artists I interviewed for that book is Scotty Hill from Skid Row, and I think this is going to feed into our conversation. It was pretty interesting, my conversation about this particular album we're going to talk about.
Yeah, very cool. And Sean, of course, runs Crash Kelly as well. This has been his neo hair metal band, I suppose, in a certain way. And Sean has been with Honeymoon Suite, Nelly Furtado, and then nascent adjacent hair metal bands like Helix, Lee Aaron, Coney Hatch. That's the cool one. I love that latest picture of you guys hanging out with Steve Harris. Steve Harris watched your whole set. That's pretty cool.
Hard to wrap my head around.
yeah, wicked, yeah. So we are talking about Skid Row today, and we're going to look at what is their most contrarian album. So Skid Row, essentially, they brought in a Canadian to keep things Canadian. We're both Canadian, and we've got Sebastian Bach coming in from Peterborough into this New Jersey band sort of thing, a little bit like the Dream Theater situation, I imagine. But they have a debut album, a self-titled on Atlantic, goes 5 times platinum in the States. A massive album. A follow-up, Slave to the Grind, in 1991, kind of heavy things up. It goes double platinum. And they are a little bit of an it band, enough of an it band that Sebastian Bach in 1991 is on the cover of Rolling Stone. Hard to believe. There's a press photo of the band from the early days. So they were kind of a little bit part of that dirty hair metal situation, a little bit moving on from Guns N' Roses. 1995, Subhuman Race. Then we have Thick Skin in 2003 and Revolutions Per Minute with Johnny Solinger, sadly no longer with us. And then they've got a new album, The Gang's All Here 2022 with Erica Green. How do you pronounce that? Grinwall. It's got a umlaut in it, anyways.
That's right.
So Sean has picked what he thinks is the most contrarian Skid Row album of all time, and there it is. And he's going to tell us why. Take it away, Sean.
Well, it's so important to understand the context in which this album came out. And for me, I remember it very clearly. It's one of the last albums where I was deeply anticipating a record from an artist. I think the last one was Chinese Democracy, Guns N' Roses. The one previous to that was Van Halen 3. And this would have been the one just prior. So it's 1995. I'm living in Vancouver. I've made my move to Vancouver because I had just scored a publishing deal with a guy named Dale Martindale, who was the singer in Images in Vogue. Okay. And this was a very transitional period in my life. I grew up with 80s hard rock. I'd formed a musical identity, a way of playing, a way of dressing, a way of looking based on this, but everything had changed quite clearly. And this was, I remember meeting with producers at the time, and everybody was talking about Soundgarden and talking about Stone Temple Pilots and how their records sounded. And so my head was very much in that headspace. It's like, oh, okay. Less reverb, right? Got it. More weird sounds, got it. It can't be uniform. It has to be different. And I think Subhuman Race totally reflects that. And it's very interesting to note the producer on this record is Bob Rock, because what we saw a year earlier with Motley Crue's album with John Corabi, we see coming to play here on this record from a production element, where the previous albums that Skid Row did with Michael Wagner, had a uniformity in the sound. There was identity and uniformity throughout the whole thing in terms of the guitar sounds, the drum sounds, and the vocal approach. We're now seeing this very, very 70s influence. We're going back to older 70s tones. We're going back to experimentation, and we're having a completely different vocal approach on this record. But what's interesting about this is, in the face of this grunge movement, Skid Row can only be Skid Row. Like a truly great band, when they touch their instruments, they sound like the individuals playing. Sebastian Bach, you can do a lot with Sebastian Bach. He's an incredibly adept vocalist, but he will ultimately only be Sebastian. Yeah. When he screams, it's different than when Chris Cornell screams. They both scream high, but Sebastian's coming from Kiss. He's coming from Geddy Lee. He's coming from his record collection, and it sounded different. Ultimately, it will always place them in a time and place, and I think that that's what happens, generally speaking. But what Bob Rock brings is a completely new approach to the rhythmic placement of the vocals. All of a sudden, the rhythms of the vocals are very different. There's more almost spoken word. He's mixing in kind of almost death metal, growly vocals with his melodic vocals. Plus, on this record, you get the very authentic punk leanings of Rachel Bolan. Rob Afuso, this is really a Rob Afuso, the drummer's record, in my opinion. We'll talk about that later. Mm-hmm. And interestingly enough, the two guitar players, Scotty Hill and Dave Sabo, what we're hearing now is those guys actually sound like they're kind of blending into each other. I couldn't tell on this record who was playing the solos, where on other records, there was a definite identity between Scotty and Snake. So lots of variety here. And I'm looking forward to diving into it.
Yeah. So this is going to be the last one for Sebastian Bach and the last one for Rob, which is kind of interesting. They supported Van Halen on the Balance tour on this as well, which is kind of interesting, right? And as we find out, I mean, it hits the charts. It gets up to kind of number 35. It stays for a while. But it doesn't certify at all, which is crazy. I mean, I did not expect this. You know, normally when you see a pattern like this, 5 times platinum down to double platinum, you're going to see a gold at least out of the next record. And this did not even go gold. But I don't know your thoughts. I mean, and delve into the songs. Feel free.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. I always thought this did go gold, but then when I went and researched, it only went gold in Japan. I was surprised by that, because I thought this was a U.S. gold record, but there is no certification. But at the time, it didn't feel like this was a flop. I remember this coming out and being very excited, but I do succinctly remember this. I remember being chastised the day I bought it by a booking agent that I was working with, because I said in a very effusive way, the new Skid Row's album's out today. I'm going down to HMV and Robson. I'm going to go buy it. And she said, why? They suck. I went, Skid Row does not suck. That's my band. Like, to me, this was a contemporary record coming out in the way a Soundgarden record or a Stone Temple Pilots record. Like, it felt still contemporary to me. That band, because they had proven themselves after the debut, they'd come out with a number 1 record. I thought this was a band moving through the times, but I realized they were not going to be afforded the opportunity. They just wouldn't be allowed the critical opportunity to be anything other than the picture frozen in time they were in the 80s. And also,
I took out these props. I may as well show my props. There we go. So that's what the debut looks like. There's what they looked like at that time. Again, kind of the punk rocky version. There's the one with the painting by Sebastian's dad on it, right?
Yeah.
And there's a Subhuman Race. There's a B-side thing. There's a thick skin in there as well. But sorry, go on.
No, it's interesting that you show this. You notice the only one where there is a Skid Row logo that's hidden underneath here, but they're making sure you know that the old Skid Row, the tattered flag logo, is obscured by this more simple, plain, reductive, logo. Like, the change is afoot, right? Yeah, so there's definitely a commercial attempt here to change things. But well, let's dive in with the songs. Like, I mean, the first single, My Enemy, when I heard it, I liked it, but I was anxious to get to the rest of the record because I thought it was pretty typical of a 1995 record, kind of a slow, plodding riff, very Sabbathy, in a lot of ways. And that was kind of the hard rock timbre of the time, right? Kind of ape a Black Sabbath vibe. but very catchy, you know, your skeletons, my skeletons, life is only getting shorter. And also this, you know, they maintain this kind of sense of rebellion. Basically every Skid Row record is a middle finger to some sort of authority figure, right? That's Rachel Bolan, seems to be one of his strong suits as a writer. What he's really great at, though, is finding colorful ways to say that. He's an evocative lyricist, and he uses good imagery. So I really don't have too much to say about the single. I thought it was very single-ish. Has a catchy chorus, you can be my enemy and I don't care, you know, keep throwing stones at yourself. Sounds like a good fist pumping thing. Great playing. I like how it goes double time at the end of the song, and that's a theme that carries on with the record. Tempo changes and variation that keeps moving the song forward.
There you go, yeah. Sean, on the booklet, of course, grunge type photography, right? Gritty.
Yeah, overexposed, you know, we're raw. We're not pretty boys here, you know. You know, which is pretty hard when you've got the genetically most perfect front man in the world, you know, like, I mean, that's kind of a tough one to overcome. But yeah, I thought as a first single, it was the logical choice and came out and sounded contemporary. But where the record really starts to get interesting for me was the second song. When I heard Fire Sign, that's when I said, okay, these guys are growing. And, you know, it's interesting. I interviewed Scotty Hill for my book, and this record was made in not a happy time for the band. They were completely burnt out. They felt pressure from the label to get out and make a new record. I've read on numerous occasions where Rachel and Snake, the principal songwriters, did not feel that they were delivering their best stuff. The band was in inner turmoil. They were fighting with Sebastian. They were fighting with each other. It was starting to fall apart. So the whole record was an unhappy experience. And I know from my own experience, when you're unhappy making a record, it stays with you because it's such a deeply personal thing. You know, I talked to Scotty. I told him how much I love this record. I don't think he was buying it. I don't know. Maybe he'll come on and interject at some point but say something different. But I don't think he was buying it. He goes, I know that people like the record, but I felt he couldn't separate himself from the bad experience that came with making it. And I also think Bob Rock can be an antagonistic producer from what I've heard, and can push people out of their comfort zones to great effect, but that's not a great feeling. And I've been pushed out of my comfort zones by producer. And it sucks, you know, even if the result is great. It's not like you walk away going, oh, well, that was worth it. It's like, screw that guy. So I think there's a little bit of that resentment, but I think it makes a great energy on this record. And Fire Sign, to me, has so many wonderful progressive elements. There's a progressive element to this record. There's this really super melodic bridge on a carousel through my yesterdays. Actually has one of my favorite lyrics of all time. I one of the lyrics in this I use as a mantra through life. Doubt sees the obstacles, faith sees the way. I often walk around saying that when I'm up against something myself. So I mean, on a very deep level, this record stayed with me, and that song did too. Yeah. There's also a very interesting thing that happens throughout the record where they have static riffs, a static bass line or guitar line while the chords move. So you'll have these chords, these kind of chromatic movements, which are pretty sophisticated. So to me, this was a very sophisticated song that still retained the heaviness of the day and still had like melodic Skid Row traits. So very cool song. Then we go on to Bonehead. Skid Row can do punk. Skid Row authentically can do punk, and they do it really well here. It sounds like a New York City hardcore song to me. And not all bands can do it. They sound like a pastiche. I think,
but it also sounds like a grunge band doing punk. It sounds a little bit like Soundgarden punk, right? Like when any of those bands pick up the speed, this sounds like that, right?
Yeah, you're right, because the guitar tones are a little more developed than punk. I shouldn't say developed. They're a little warmer than you'd find on a punk record. I mean, a lot like those New York bands, it literally sounds like they plugged in and the first setting that was on the amp, they just went for it. Where here, there's definitely, you're right, that 70s influenced brownness or roundness to the tones, right? Yeah, it's almost like Anthrax, but whereas Anthrax kind of had developed out of really were their version of thrash is more authentic. With Skid Row, I always find when they try to do thrash, they end up sounding like a punk band doing thrash.
Yeah. Good point.
And when they do punk, they sound like a grunge band doing punk.
Yeah.
So anyway, that song, just what I like about it is that how the very simple elements, Bob Rock keeps adding textures and tones. He keeps adding different guitar tones and different guitar voicings that kind of serve as energizers in the terrace dynamics that happen in the song. So I think it's an effective punk song with, hey, if you're a new god, let me see a miracle. Great hook.
Yeah.
Stick with one anti-authoritative phrase and just say it over and over again.
Yeah. Yeah.
Moving on to Beat Yourself Blind.
Mm-hmm.
Heavy. Starts with I love the bass riff on this. Starts with a distorted bass riff. Rachel has a lot of really great, well-developed bass lines on this album. And
Call it tubby. It's tubby bass on this, right?
Yeah.
It's definitely that grunge bass, right?
Well, you know what? I think that's the old, it's a bass through a rat distortion pedal into an SVT cabinet. That's that sound. I call it the vacuum cleaner. It's got that vacuum cleaner sound. Yeah. Jamie Stewart from The Cult was the first person who showed me that, and ironically, he got it from, I think it was Bob Rock, because when they did Sonic Temple in Vancouver at Little Mountain Sound. So there you go. Mm-hmm. So must be a Vancouver thing. Great song about self-pleasure, beat yourself blind, an open eye and a closed mind. I mean, okay, that's inspiration, but I like once again, just the rhythm of the words. Carry out another stone as a slave. Ask General Know-It-All who juggling the earth. There's a lot of really interesting rhythmic vocal play on this record, and it feels good. And words like smack around a bit of what it takes to pledge, smack, pledge. Sebastian has so much spit and attitude in his vocals. When he punctuates all those things, you feel it coming at you in the speakers, right? Yeah. So, and also this is another one of those great rhythmic displacements. Beat yourself blind, beat yourself blind. It's almost like hemiola rhythms playing against each other, and it just has lots of attitude.
It's funny, Sean. We just recently did a whole Dark Horse panel episode on Judas Priest Jugulator. And one of the criticisms there of Ripper was that he was over hamming it up. It's over aggressive, right? And I, going through this record again, I felt a little bit of that with Sebastian Bach. You can hear the spit flying, right? Kind of thing. It's just everything is so articulated and enunciated and so aggressive that it almost sounds a little over the top, right?
I don't disagree. And, at the time I felt it was super effective. I think in retrospect, what you're hearing is Bob Rock bucking against his previous successes and really trying to keep his head above water in an era where all these bands who were icons were now becoming rapidly so uncool. Mm-hmm. So I think if 80s rock represented corporate sameness, he was going to be absolutely different. Even when we listen to Saint Anger, right? What he did with that drum sound on Saint Anger, it's taking something and pushing it to its limits. But at the end of the day, you can't change the fact that elementally these guys are great players schooled on classic hard rock and heavy metal. So just the way they touch the instruments is going to be different. It's going to sound a little more refined than bands who grew up with different influences.
Mm-hmm. Cool. All right. Yeah. Anything about Eileen remains to be seen?
Okay. Eileen is probably one of my second favorite track on the record. I absolutely love this. It's a song. I remember reading this. It's a song about someone who lived in Rachel's neighborhood who was suffering from a mental disorder or mental problems, and how when you're a kid, when you see things like that, it can be scary and off-putting, right? It feels unnatural. So I thought he captures something very, very well here. Eileen is calling me to sit a while and talk to trees, and the things you say are scaring me. I felt there was an innocence in the lyric here that drew me in. And I'm getting goosebumps thinking about it because it goes so well with the riff and it's almost got an Alice Cooper type vibe to it. Feels very 1970s. Isn't that a very 1970s thing? I can picture riding around your bike, back in the day when we'd just be free and riding around our bicycles, and there'd be the local kind of guy or poor woman, poor soul who was left to wander the streets in your small town. And it's ooh, better stay away. That could be a little dicey, but there's no parents around because you left the house in the morning and came home at night. Yeah. Like you're constantly experiencing danger. You're going to railroad tracks and there's poor guys laying out there. Like, but that's what it brought me back to, you know, and great, beautiful solo by Snake on this one too. Super melodic, super creepy. Anyway, I thought it was very effective. Remains to be seen. It's in a tie for my favorite song on the record. I think this is another one that feels like very 1970s to me. Mm-hmm. It's almost like, to me, Aerosmith meets Grand Funk Railroad. I don't know what the hell it's about, but I love the lyrics, you know. Trip the Lightning Spastic, Captain Fantastic, the 1970s, Dive Head on Me. Like, it's very Blacklight Poster to me. And I like that. And great riffs. There's an amazing part where the rhythm turns around at the end and it goes into double time, and it has my favorite lyric on the record. Hold on, let me. Commies, kinks, and masochists, weirdos loving homicide, witches, freaks, and 45s. Kick a painted pony, let the spinning wheel ride. Like if you grew up, you know, your blood, sweat, and tears on the radio, that turn on, you know, kick a painted pony. It's like, that really summarizes what Skid Row's about to me. 70s influence, but you know, a little bit of punk attitude. Anyway, I love it.
Cool.
Oh, and also this one's cool. There's an electric sitar that appears for like 4 bars in the solo. It's like, why? But why not? Because that was what producers were doing at the time. It's like, hey, remember in the 80s when it could only be digital processed gear? Yeah. And now all these old things are cool again. I've got one of those. I've got an old chorus pedal. I've got an electric sitar, and we're going to use it all. And Bob Rock did.
But every hair metal band who did a grunge album had to include a sitar at some point, right? It was like part of the code. So
I did it too. I did it too in the early 2000s. I'm very proud because you're showing how diverse you are. Yeah, I'm not a hair metal guy. I'm diverse. Witness my new direction.
Yeah.
Okay, man. So then we're getting on to the title track, Subhuman Race. This is interesting. The drum tones change. When on the thrash song, Bob changed, or whoever was engineering, Randy Staub, I can't remember, it's in there somewhere. But whoever's engineering, the drum sound becomes more compressed. On the other tracks, you've got that kind of trashy thing Rob Affuso did where it's splashy, a little splatty, very 70s sounding drums. Mm-hmm. And on this one, it's got that very hyper compressed, focused drum sound. So this one actually feels the most thrash to me. It's like, oh, okay, this sounds like a concerted effort to make this sound thrashy. And I think it's very effective. I like, once again, for me, thrash works when the grooves change and I get at least a little bit of a straight ahead groove instead of the I need a little bit of and they do that in here in the verses. You know, Rachel Bolan pushing the envelope. Jesus knows my story, knows the position that I'm in. A hooker knows the feeling to get effed the way I've been. It's like, okay, that's a little on the nose, but okay. But, you know, once again, you make me feel like I'm subhuman. I'm a subhuman race. Good, kind of like a little bit of Slave to the Grind type vibe, right?
Yeah.
Good title track. Yeah. Great solo, too. Then we move on to Frozen. Ultra grunge, right? Ultra Black Sabbath. But the riffs are ferocious. And there's a little bit of Priest in here too. Dun, 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 dun. I don't know, just in the guitar approach. I hear the distinct guitar things. I love the way that Rob varies the pattern, the drum patterns in the verses. Dun, 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 dun. No, it's in 4/4, but just the way he's going. Dun, dun, bap,
exactly.
Bap, bap.
I remember the same thing looking at this one. Like there's a lot of, I mean, there is dropping the beat and some odd time signatures, but then there's a lot of tricky 4/4. And this is one that's tricky 4/4, right?
Yeah, totally. And I like that. I thought it was effective. And Bob Rock is enough of a dynamic producer to know when that's going on, you drop out something else. And there's a lot of that in this record. A lot of guitars dropping out of nowhere and then a clean guitar taking over. And it makes the heavy parts heavier. And that's what I really did love about grunge, and what grunge brought back to rock and roll was the dynamics. Because there was a while where, I mean, it was the same guitar players, same producers, same process sounds. I mean, every record, just like a brick, you know, it just was kind of hitting you the same way. This one, and especially on this track, there's a lot of that. And Sebastian is pushing himself vocally too, which is effective. Great lyrics. I'll dust away the fallings, the winter leaves for me. I'll stare into the fire and set tomorrow free. I like his evocative imagery in this. I felt like I'm staring into a fire and I'm frozen. Like I like songs that actually it's like my dad used to say, I like a painting that looks like the thing it's supposed to be.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know about this abstract stuff. I like that looks like fruit in a bowl, yeah, you know, yeah. And I thought that was, I thought this song's like that.
Cool, yeah.
And now we're into another.
Yep.
And to me, this is a brilliant pop song. And man, I credit them for being able to sneak a 7/4 riff into a pop song, right? Like it doesn't hit me that something was different. It's like Alex Lifeson is so good at. He's just following the logical melody, and it just happens to fall in the 7 beats, right? Dun, 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 bum, bum, bum. It's just the line. Yeah. So it doesn't feel forced, and beautiful arpeggiated guitars, nice textures, big chorus. And, you know, I think this record, if there's any criticism from a pop standpoint, there weren't that many big sing-along choruses necessarily. This one had it. I want something you could sing along with, you know. Mm-hmm. Show me a sign to a light that shines one direction into another, sheltered peace of mind. It sings well, and it tells a story. So I think, and also I got to say the guitar solo, this is one of those things where I think, like when I interviewed Scotty in the book, he said, you know, Snake and I have started to sound like each other over the years, or we're such a guitar team. We started to sound, and I thought for sure this was a Scotty Hill solo. The tone is, and the note choice is evocative of what Scotty had done on the ballads on Slave to the Grind, but it's Snake. And it's one of my favorite solos, you know, top 20 for me, at least, of all time. And certainly one of my favorite on the record. Nice. Really melodic. Yeah.
Okay. Bass Against My Soul.
Yeah. Wow. This is Rob Affuso's, masterwork. The drumming at the end of this, he just keeps churning and turning the rhythm ideas, getting faster and faster against a static 2-chord movement thing. Really cool. That's what stands out to me on this one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Medicine Jar.
Yeah. Medicine Jar. This could have been on Slave to the Grind. This sounds the most like an older Skid Row song to me. Like it could have been, even the lyrics are very, the drugs are bad thing. Look at these weird characters doing drugs. Great lyrics too, that sing really well. I mean, maybe not the most sensitive lyric, but dropping like a bomb on heroes, shaking like a San Francisco. It sings really well, and it's clever. It's a cut above what bands of that era were doing lyrically. Mm-hmm. And just could have been on Slave to the Grind. Good driving tune. Love it.
Yeah.
Now breaking down. A lot of people don't like this song. I love this song. I think it's just beautiful. Really effective texturally, and where it deviates from other songs, I guess it's just because I'm a guitar player. It's the guitar tones. They incorporated this very Telecaster country B-bendery type thing. Like there's all these country textures in this. Sebastian has a very naked, present vocal, raspy. It sounded like he'd been screaming all day, and then Bob made him go in and sing this song. Like you can actually hear his voice breaking up and distorting almost at times. But absolutely beautiful song. Some very U2 textures in there too. I think Snake wrote that song all by himself. So I don't think it's necessarily the most lyrically deep song in the world, but it's effective. I'm breaking down, and it sounds like someone breaking down. Good.
Yeah. Then Iron Will, which is actually quite similar to Medicine Jar in a lot of ways, right?
Totally. And for me, Iron Will has that kind of Pantera type vibe. There's some spoken word things. You could tell, I think those bands were rubbing off on each other. But I don't think that Skid Row gets enough credit for the influence they had on Pantera. If this isn't Skid Row trying to ape Pantera, Pantera went out opening up for these guys, right? And remember, Pantera had been a commercial metal band, right? Like it really had more hair aspects than we came to know them as they became popular. But they would have been aware of what Skid Row was doing and how Skid Row was taking the classic 80s hard rock thing and giving it more street, more punk, more attitude. And I think that this just kind of proved my point that really Skid Row should have been looked at as contemporaries at the time. They were still young. They still had the vitality and the energy. And unfortunately, the cultural zeitgeist at the time was just part of the narrative was that any band from that era was just persona non grata. Mm-hmm. And that's really what this record suffers from. It's nothing musical. This feels like a complete correct evolutionary step for a band. And unfortunately, it was tainted, I think, just by perception, by commercial perception. And it's too bad because I think people should go back and listen to this record and they'll find renewed interest in it.
Yeah, that's wicked. That's a great job, Sean. I mean, and the funny thing is, like, going back and playing Slave recently for some show I had to go on or whatever, was I basically feel like the first two albums have dated a little worse over the last little while, just gradually. And Slave also kind of the same. And this one, it already has done all its ridicule and dating. So it's almost like people can't look at it any worse than it is. And I loved it when it came out. I thought it was, because I was into that whole thing. I wanted these bands to grow and change. I mean, along with everybody else, I was totally in that whole, I've had enough of the formula of hair metal. I want to see these bands do something different. And it was super heavy again, and in a lot of ways, with Baz, always sort of on about how Slave to the Grind was so heavy. I mean, this is a heavier album in a way, right? Because that still does have a lot of the hair metal tropes in it, a lot more than we care to admit, because the narrative was that, we're so much heavier than on the Skid Row album, right?
Well, that's it. And I think these guys still care. Like, anytime I hear Sebastian talk about it, I can see the pain the guy goes through when he's going back to this time, right? Yeah. To his perception of the way he was treated and the way they were treated. Like Scotty says it when I talked to him too. Like, I mean, they went from heroes to being laughed at. Yeah. And it's like, there's nothing to laugh at on this record. It delivered with authority, with passion. I mean, I feel the passion, whether that passion came from a joyful place or a place of misery, doesn't matter. It's in the grooves, right? And I agree with you.
Very cool. Well, there you go. So Skid Row's most contrarian album, I suppose it is, if you think about what came later. I mean, they recovered their pop sensibility, but their heaviness and their punkness and all that. And then I suppose a lot of what was in this record is missing from, the Johnny Solinger and Eric era as well. So, I mean, essentially, I suppose this is their most contrarian album, right?
I'd have to say, I mean, in terms of expectation, what they were coming from before, it definitely is. It polarizes. And I know people who think, it's not very good, but they never even heard the record. Like, they just had the perception. I said, did you actually listen? It's like, no.
yeah, exactly. And it's almost, I'm going a little far here, but it's almost one of these albums like rock journalists don't talk about very much because they hate trying to figure out whether you're supposed to type Subhuman Race in reverse upper lower case. It's like every time we have to write about Motley Crue or Blue Oyster Cult or Queensryche, we got to do that 5-step process to get the umlaut on there, right?
Totally.
Or type WASP. You got W switch, cap dot A dot S dot, right?
We've lost a lot of our lives to that, Martin.
Exactly. Yeah. I think when we get to heaven, that'll be one of the ones. You spent 4.5 hours dealing with umlauts over your lifetime, right? Funny. So there you go. Subhuman Race, most contrarian Skid Row album. Get Sean's book. This is an awesome book. ECW Press, beautifully put together. The type styles, the photo section, everything's really cool in here. The way the oral history part of it is broken up makes for a really cool read. Let us know in the comments below what you think of this. Subscribe, all that kind of stuff. if you want to join our Patreon situation, that's how you get onto the panels. And we love doing those panels. That's almost like taking on a life of its own. Those panels go an hour and a half sometimes on these albums. And it's really cool to see who shows up and puts in their stuff. All the wise music swamis joining our Patreon situation. Very cool. So on behalf of Sean, there you go. Go listen to some Skid Row.